It begins not with a cry, but with a bow. André Rieu stands beneath the golden lights, his violin pressed against his heart, as if he could still hold Time itself between the strings. For decades, his concerts have felt like small miracles, places where war, grief, and politics disappeared into a single, sweeping melody. But now, whispers ripple through the crowd. André Rieu is saying goodbye. The words hang heavy, like the final note of a waltz that refuses to fade. He was never just a conductor. He was a bridge between centuries, the man who brought Strauss back to life, who made classical music breathe again. Born in Maastricht, a boy surrounded by silence and discipline, he learned early that music was not only sound, it was survival. His father, a strict conductor of the Limburg Symphony Orchestra, demanded perfection. Every note out of place felt like a sin. In that household, emotion was forbidden. Yet André, with his restless soul and curious smile, carried rebellion in his fingers. When he was 5, he would sneak to the corner of the practice room, touching the violin as if it were alive. He once said, "That was my first love. Not a person, but a promise." While other children played football, he was learning the art of patience, bowing, tuning, repeating, until his fingers bled. The silence of that house, heavy, judgmental, and cold, carved his music into something both tender and defiant. Years later, when he formed the Johann Strauss Orchestra, critics laughed. They called it nostalgia. They said waltzes were dead, that no one wanted beauty anymore. But André Rieu believed that joy could still conquer cynicism. With his golden curls, his theatrical smile, and his unapologetic warmth, he turned every concert into a cathedral of light. Millions came. They danced, they cried, they believed again. Yet, behind the sparkle, exhaustion. Behind the applause, loneliness. Every tour meant endless cities, endless rehearsals, endless pain in the back, in the fingers, in the heart. He often said, "People think happiness is effortless, but every smile on stage costs something." When the rumors of illness began, it was not the first Time the world had feared losing him. Years ago, he had collapsed from viral vertigo, unable to stand, unable to play, forced into silence for months. He confessed later that the silence frightened him more than death. Now, as headlines scream, "Tragic diagnosis," fans revisit those old fears. They imagine the waltz master laying down his bow for the last Time. But if you watch him closely in the quiet moments backstage, when the cameras fade, there's still that boy from Maastricht inside him, fragile, fearless, waiting for one more melody, one more night of light before the silence. It began with a tremor slight, invisible to most eyes, but unmistakable to the man who had lived his entire life by precision. André Rieu felt it first in his bow hand. During rehearsal, the strings of his violin seemed to resist Hayam, as if whispering a warning. At 75, he had survived vertigo, exhaustion, and the endless strain of touring. But this felt different, a shadow crawling behind every note. The diagnosis came quietly, without the thunder of headlines or the sympathy of journalists. He kept it private, at first, as all artists do when pain threatens their craft. But inside, something shifted. Doctors spoke in gentle phrases, but the words landed like knives. Neurological complications, rest required, indefinite suspension of performances. For a man whose heartbeat had always followed the rhythm of the orchestra, rest was not mercy. It was exile. He stared at the violin on his bedside table, polished, waiting, accusing. The silence in the room was unbearable. He once said, "Music is not what I do, it's what I am." And now, that am was slipping away. The diagnosis, whether temporary or not, felt like a theft, not only of health, but of identity. His team tried to shield the truth, framing his absence as exhaustion. But André knew the real battle was not with illness, it was with meaning itself. What does a maestro become when the baton is taken from his hand? In Maastricht, where his castle overlooks the river, he walked the gardens alone, tracing memories through the fog. Each tree, each stone had heard his laughter, his rehearsals, his dreams of turning a waltz into an act of resistance against cynicism. Now, even the birds seemed to play in minor key. Fans began to send letters by the thousands words of hope, prayers, gratitude. Some wrote, "Your music helped me survive my own diagnosis." Others, "If you must stop, let us play for you." There were nights when he read those letters aloud, his voice trembling like a distant violin. The house that once rang with music now echoed with silence and the soft creak of memory. In one of his journals he wrote, "I always feared the encore, because every encore means the end is near. But even in pain, André Rieu could not live without creating." Between treatments, he began composing quietly, not for the stage, but for he himself. Simple melodies, fragile, almost like prayers. He said to a friend, "If I can no longer play for the world, I'll play for heaven instead." It was in those fragile days that the world began to misunderstand. A few tabloids and YouTube videos twisted his retreat into tragedy. André Rieu says goodbye forever. False headlines spread faster than truth ever could. Yet behind the noise, the man he himself remained calm, not defeated, reflective. In an interview that slipped past most headlines, he whispered, "Every illness teaches you how to listen again, not to the orchestra, but to your own soul." The world heard rumors of death, but André Rieu was hearing something else entirely: rebirth. They thought the curtain had fallen, that the maestro had bowed for the last TMA. But André Rieu had never been a man of endings, only of transformations. He once said, "Every waltz begins with a step into uncertainty." And so, even as his body trembled and doctors cautioned restraint, he took that step again into the unknown, into healing, into harmony. Pain became his new metronome. Every morning began slowly, not with applause or tuning violins, but with silence, breath, and the soft ticking of a clock. His hands, once flawless in motion, sometimes refused to obey. There were days when his bow slipped, when frustration turned to tears. But André never saw illness as defeat. He saw it as a lesson in humility. "The body falters," he said, "so the soul can learn to sing." At night, under the Maastricht sky, he would sit by the open window of his castle and hum fragments of unfinished compositions. The music that once soared across arenas now floated gently over the river Meuse. His wife, Marjorie, often found Chaim there, half in shadow, half in moonlight, whispering melodies to no one. She once said, "He doesn't need an audience to perform. The stars are enough." The orchestra, too, felt his absence like a missing heartbeat. Some members wept when they rehearsed without him. Yet they also knew he was with them in spirit, in every tempo, every pause. When they played the second waltz in Vienna without their leader, a strange calm filled the hall. The conductor's stand was empty, but the crowd stood and applauded, as if André he himself had just bowed. His struggle became a quiet symphony of endurance. The same man who once filled stadiums now learned the grace of stillness. He began writing letters to young musicians, not about fame or tours, but about faith. "Do not chase the applause," he wrote. "Chase the note that tells the truth." Some of those letters leaked online, read by millions, and unexpectedly, a new audience formed not in concert halls, but in hearts. People saw in André not just a musician, but a mirror, a man who had everything, yet still searched for peace, a man who turned pain into art and art into prayer. When the rumors of farewell reached their loudest, he responded not with denial, but with music. From his studio came a new composition, the Waltz of Silence. A haunting piece, written with trembling hands, built on the tension between sorrow and light. It begins in minor, barely breathing, then rises fragile but unstoppable until it bursts into golden harmony. Those who heard it said it felt like hearing a man heal himself through sound. André released it quietly, with no press, no tour, no announcement. Just a line on his website. Dedicated to everyone who dances with pain. Is the Denatan. In that moment, the diagnosis no longer mattered. The rumors no longer mattered. The disease, the fatigue, the endless headlines, all became part of the same song. André Rieu had done what only true artists can. He turned suffering into beauty, silence into faith, fragility into fire. It was midsummer when the stage began to rise again in Vrijthof Square, the heart of Maastricht, André Rieu's eternal cathedral. For decades, that square had been his altar, his homecoming, his love letter to the world. Every July, the cobblestones bloomed with flowers, flags, and music. But this time, the mood was different. The lights glowed softer. The banners read simply. For André, rumors had swelled like thunderclouds, illness, retirement, and farewell. Yet, when the first violin sounded, the air itself seemed to stop. From the back of the stage, walking slowly but upright, André Rieu appeared, dressed in his iconic navy tailcoat, the violin pressed to his chest as if shielding a fragile flame. The crowd, 20,000 strong, did not cheer at first. They wept. He smiled, not with the showman's charm, but with the tenderness of a man who has seen death and chosen life anyway. His bow lifted. The first notes of The Blue Danube unfolded soft, hesitant, trembling like a heartbeat, learning to trust again. For a moment, it seemed the world was breathing in Waltz. Midway through the performance, the lights dimmed, and he paused. I was told, he said softly, that silence would be my companion from now on. But you see, silence has rhythm too. The audience laughed through tears. Then he began the Waltz of Silence, the piece born from his convalescence, the melody that had carried Chaim through the dark months. No pyrotechnics, no grand gestures, just one man, a violin, and a lifetime condensed into sound. The orchestra followed Chaim like a heartbeat. The air shimmered with restraint and surrender. Each note felt like forgiveness. When he reached the final crescendo, a delicate rise from despair into radiant harmony, people in the front rows clasped hands, strangers united by something wordless. Behind the curtain, his son Pierre watched, his eyes glistening. He had been the one who insisted his father should not give up. Play for yourself, Papa, he had said, even if it's just once more. That night, André did, but he also played for everyone who had ever faced their own ending and still found the courage to begin again. When the last note fell, he lowered his bow and closed his eyes. For a few seconds, there was only wind. Then, slowly, the crowd rose, not shouting, not chanting, just standing in reverent silence. Thousands of candles flickered across the square, turning the night into a sea of trembling stars. André Rieu bowed deeply one final time and whispered, "Thank you for letting me live twice." Some said it was his farewell, others said it was his resurrection. Perhaps both were true. Because the truth about André Rieu is this: he was never merely performing music. He was performing life raw, beautiful, temporary. As he walked off stage, he turned once more toward the crowd. The cameras caught it a faint smile, a tear slipping down his cheek, the soft whisper of a man who had given everything. Every waltz, he murmured, is a goodbye that sounds like hope. Long after the final applause faded from Vrijthof Square, the air of Maastricht still carried something invisible. Not the echo of violins, but the echo of a man's spirit. The square, the fountains, the quiet streets that once trembled beneath the rhythm of the Blue Danube, now seemed to breathe in slower time, as if the entire city had been tuned to André Rieu's heartbeat. For weeks, people left flowers at the gates of his castle, not out of grief, but gratitude. They whispered, "Thank you," as if addressing a saint of sound. Inside the castle, the maestro's violin lay upon a velvet cloth, its wood gleaming like a relic of faith. The bow rested beside it, frayed by decades of devotion. Every groove in the fingerboard held a story. The sweat of exhaustion, the tears of triumph, the fingerprints of a man who refused to let beauty die. His team, the Johann Strauss Orchestra, gathered there one evening after the concert. They did not rehearse. They simply sat in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the ivy on the walls. One of them whispered, "It feels like he's still conducting." André Rieu's legacy had never been about technique. It was about emotion. In a century where music had become digital and cold, he had retaught the world how to feel. He made old melodies breathe again, not through perfection, but through vulnerability. "A single wrong note played with love," he once said, "is worth more than a flawless performance without heart." That belief turned him into both a rebel and a healer. As news of his diagnosis continued to circulate, many assumed the curtain had truly closed. But instead, something extraordinary began to happen. Across Europe, young violinists gathered in public squares to play his waltzes. In Vienna, 1,000 people danced spontaneously beneath the statue of Johann Strauss. In Japan, students held candlelit performances in his honor. On social media, clips of his farewell concert spread like prayer, captioned with words such as, "He taught us to live in three-quarter time." In that global wave of melody, André Rieu had transcended illness. His body might have weakened, but his influence had multiplied. His message that joy was a form of resistance, that music could heal the fractures of the modern soul, became even louder. Philosophers wrote essays about his artistry. Psychologists cited his concerts as examples of collective catharsis. Doctors wrote letters to him, saying patients in recovery listened to his music as therapy. One hospital in Amsterdam renamed its courtyard the Waltz Garden. Meanwhile, André himself withdrew from public life, not out of despair, but peace. In the mornings, he walked the gardens with his wife, tracing the rhythm of the river. He kept a small notebook in his coat pocket pages, filled not with compositions, but reflections. On one page he wrote, "To live is to conduct chaos into harmony." On another, "If pain is the tempo, let gratitude be the key." He began to record short videos for his fans, quiet, intimate, filmed from his study. No stage lights, no orchestra, just André, speaking gently. "My dear friends, do not be sad. I am still here, just listening more than before." Those videos went viral, watched by millions who had grown up waltzing through his sound. It wasn't fame they saw now, but wisdom, the serenity of a man who had faced mortality and found meaning within it. He spoke about music, the way monks speak about silence. "Every note," he said, "is a prayer that disappears, yet somehow remains." In his absence, the Johann Strauss Orchestra continued performing, but every concert opened with an empty chair at the front, draped with his navy coat and his violin resting upon it. They called it the Chair of Light. During the encore, spotlights illuminated it, and the audience would rise in silence. Some cried, some smiled. All felt that André was there, conducting not with his hands, but with memory. Critics who once dismissed him as sentimental began to revise their words. "He turned kitsch into cathedral," wrote one columnist. Another said, "Rieu's concerts were not nostalgia, they were rebellion against cynicism, against despair." Indeed, what André Rieu had done was not merely revive the waltz, he had resurrected the idea that beauty still mattered, that even in an age of chaos, there was still room for grace. As months passed, his health stabilized. He began to walk stronger. His color returned. A close friend revealed, "He doesn't talk about retirement anymore. He talks about tempo slower, perhaps, but steady." Rumors of a final symphony began to swirl a project he was composing in secret, said to be called Echoes of Heaven. No one knew if it would ever be performed, but those who had seen the early score described it as a summation of everything he was: joy, sorrow, nostalgia, faith. André Rieu's name has long been printed on albums, posters, tickets, but now it lives elsewhere in the small, invisible moments of everyday life. A violin teacher guiding her students through the Emperor Waltz. A grandmother humming the second waltz while cooking dinner. A child spinning in the living room, pretending to conduct. That is where his true encore exists, not in stadiums, but in souls. In an interview months after his last concert, he was asked what legacy he hoped to leave. He smiled faintly and said, "I never wanted statues or schools named after me. I only wanted to remind people that beauty is still worth fighting for." Then he looked down, gently tapping the table, as if keeping Time only he could hear. "If I've done that," he said softly, "then the music doesn't end, it just changes key." And so it is that André Rieu, the man who danced through pain and conducted through storms, did not vanish into silence. He dissolved into melody infinite, weightless, unending. Somewhere tonight, a violin begins to play, and in the trembling of its strings, you can almost hear his voice. Every goodbye is only a prelude. Morning in Maastricht came quietly. The mist drifted over the Meuse like slow music, and from the windows of Chateau de Rieu, the first light touched the grand piano in the corner of the study. André sat beside it, his hands still, his eyes half closed. For months, he had been silent, not out of weakness, but out of listening. "When you stop playing," he once said, "the world begins to sing back to you." And now, the world was singing again, faint but clear, through the branches, through the heartbeat of the city he loved. He had reached an age where legacy no longer frightened Chaim. Death had walked beside Chaim once, whispering through dizziness and fatigue, and he had learned to make peace with its rhythm. But something within him refused to accept that silence was the final act. So, one morning, he opened his old leather notebook and wrote 2 words on a blank page: "Echoes begin." That was how his final composition was born. Unlike his waltzes of triumph, this piece was fragile, introspective, written for the soul, not the stage. The melody came slowly, as if from somewhere beyond memory. It began with a single note, held too long, trembling on the edge of breaking like breath itself. He built it layer by layer, with violins that rose like prayers, cellos that sighed like forgiveness, and flutes that glimmered like sunlight on water. He called it Echoes of Heaven. His doctors still insisted on rest, but André ignored the word. He believed music could heal what medicine could not, so he composed in short bursts, 10 minutes at a TMA, his body weak but his spirit luminous. The castle became his sanctuary. Every room carried a fragment of sound. In the mornings, he wrote at the piano. By evening, he recorded the violin parts by himself, his bow hand still trembling, but steady enough to speak. "This isn't music for people to dance to," he told his wife. "It's for people who have stopped dancing and want to begin again." The months of composition became an act of resurrection. He would wake before dawn, walk barefoot into the garden, and listen to the rhythm of the wind through the ivy. Sometimes, he said he could hear the ghosts of his past performances, Vienna, Sydney, Buenos Aires, floating through the mist. Each place where he had once brought joy now whispered back to Chaim in gratitude. It was as if the world itself was waltzing toward Chaim, gently, patiently, waiting for its maestro to return. When he finished the first movement of Echoes of Heaven, he wept. It wasn't sadness, It was recognition. In that music was his whole life. The child who had rebelled against silence, the man who had resurrected joy, and the elder who now faced the dusk with grace. The melody carried his triumphs and his failures, his laughter and his loss, and above all, his belief that even when sound dies, love does not. News of his secret project began to leak. A journalist from De Telegraaf wrote that André Rieu was writing his own requiem. Others said it was his final message to the world. But when asked directly, he smiled. "No," he said softly. "It's not a requiem. It's a sunrise." In late autumn, he invited a few trusted friends and orchestra members to the castle for a private hearing. The great hall was lit only by candles. The score rested on a wooden stand, pages fluttering in the gentle draught. When the first notes began, even the air seemed to hold its breath. It was not the jubilant waltz of old. It was deeper, intimate, trembling, almost sacred. The violins wove through minor keys like threads of memory. The harps whispered like angels at the edge of hearing. Then, in the final passage, came a shift. The chords lifted, pure and golden, until the room itself seemed to glow. No one spoke when it ended. There was nothing to say. One cellist wiped her tears. Another whispered, "It feels like forgiveness." André lowered his bow, exhausted but radiant. "That," he said quietly, "is the sound of beginning again." After that night, the legend of Echoes of Heaven spread across the classical world. But André refused to release it to streaming platforms. He wanted it to live as an experience, not a file. So he decided to perform it once, and only once, at Street. Servus Basilica, the oldest church in Maastricht. The concert was to be invitation only. No cameras, no microphones, just living souls and sound. Tickets were not sold. They were given to hospital workers, music teachers, and children learning the violin. "They are the real orchestra," he said. On the night of the performance, the basilica shimmered with candlelight. The pews were filled with people who had once healed, grieved, or fallen in love to his music. As he entered, the entire crowd rose, not in ovation, but in prayerful silence. He lifted his bow slower now, deliberate, and began the piece that had grown from his illness, his solitude, and his faith. The sound filled the vaulted ceilings like dawn, filling a horizon. Near the finale, something extraordinary happened. The orchestra faded to near silence, and André played alone. Each note hovered in the air, trembling, glowing, then dissolving into stillness. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Even the church bells outside waited. And when the final chord arrived, it didn't crash. It ascended. It felt less like an ending, and more like the slow, luminous rising of a soul, leaving its body and turning into light. When the last vibration died away, André looked up toward the ancient ceiling, as though listening for an answer. Then, softly, he smiled. "The music," he whispered, "never really ends. It just finds another ear to begin again." That night, as the audience left in silence, many swore they heard the faint sound of violins in the distance, carried by the wind over the river. Some said it was imagination. Others said it was André himself already conducting the stars. He returned home past midnight, tired but peaceful. In his study, the candle still burned beside the piano. He placed the bow across his violin and whispered, "Rest now." Outside, the bells of Maastricht struck 12, and with each echo, the city seemed to breathe in harmony, as if the maestro's final gift had not been a song, but a way to listen again. When dawn broke the next morning, Maastricht was silent. Not the ordinary kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but that rare, sacred stillness that lingers after something eternal has passed through. The city seemed to move slower, softer, as if unwilling to disturb the echo that still hovered over its rooftops. The basilica bells had stopped ringing hours ago, yet their vibration seemed trapped in the air, shimmering faintly like light on water. People walking through the old square could still feel it, the invisible rhythm left by André Rieu's bow. In the days that followed, no one could quite explain what had happened inside Street Servas that night. Journalists called it a farewell drenched in faith. Musicians described it as a bridge between heaven and earth. But for those who were there, it was something simpler, a more human a moment when sound became prayer, when art became redemption. André retreated from public view once more, not in defeat, but in peace. He had nothing left to prove, nothing left to chase. His doctors said his health had stabilized miraculously, though they couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the music, one of them said. Perhaps, but those who knew Chaim best believed it was acceptance. The quiet decision to live not by tempo, but by truth. Each morning he sat by the same window, overlooking the river, a cup of tea steaming beside the violin he no longer touched. Sommetti Imes, he read poetry. Sommetti Imes, he simply stared at the water. One of his favorite lines was from Rilke. Everything is gestation, and then bringing forth. He would smile and whisper, yes. Even silence. Letters continued to arrive from all over the world, from hospitals, orphanages, even prison chapels, all describing how echoes of heaven had changed lives. One woman in Argentina wrote that her comatose husband opened his eyes when the piece was played. A young violinist from Poland said it gave her courage to perform for her dying mother. A war veteran from Ukraine said, I had forgotten how to feel until I heard that sound. André read every letter slowly, as though savoring each word like a note. He answered many of them by hand, his cursive still elegant, his tone always humble. Thank you for reminding me why I play. Meanwhile, the world began to mythologize Chaim. Documentaries, essays, and tributes appeared across Europe. Critics, who had once mocked his sentimentalism, now spoke of his courage to bring beauty back into a cynical world. They called Chaim the alchemist of emotion, the last romantic, the maestro who healed the masses. Yet André himself never used the word legacy. He told a visitor from BBC Radio, legacy is for statues. I prefer resonance. Resonance is alive. He refused statues, indeed. When Maastricht city officials proposed erecting a bronze monument of Chaim in Vrijthof Square, he gently declined. Let the square stay open, he said, so that children can dance there. That will be my monument. Months passed, and the rumor mill began again, whispers of another illness, another retirement. But those close to Chaim said he was not dying. He was transforming. He lives in the rhythm of seasons now, his wife told a journalist. He doesn't count years, he counts sunrises. He would still attend orchestra rehearsals, Sommetti Imes, sitting quietly in the back, eyes half closed, mouthing the notes without playing. The younger musicians trembled at his presence not out of fear, but awe. He radiated calm, a kind of luminous gravity that filled the room without sound. Once, when a nervous young violinist played a wrong note and apologized, André smiled and said, "There are no wrong notes in honesty." That line would later become the motto engraved above the stage of the Johann Strauss Orchestra. One evening, in December, snow began to fall over Maastricht, the first snow since his farewell concert. The city's lights glowed like candles, and through the frosted windows of his study, André watched the flakes drift silently across the river. His wife asked softly, "Do you miss it? The stage?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "The stage was only the frame. The music was always here." He placed a hand over his heart and smiled. Later that night, he took out a blank sheet of paper and began writing. It wasn't a score, it was a letter. To the young musician, it began. "Do not fear silence. It is the canvas of every song. Learn to listen before you play. The world is noisy, but truth whispers. Follow that whisper. He signed it simply, André. That letter, discovered after his death years later, would be printed in music schools across the world. As May passed, Echoes of Heaven became something more than a composition. It became a ritual. Every year, on the anniversary of its performance, orchestras around the globe played it at sunset. Churches opened their doors. Candles were lit in concert halls from Vienna to Buenos Aires. For 6 minutes, the world stopped and listened. Some called it Rieu Hour. Others called it the Golden Silence. At his castle, André lived those years quietly, surrounded by books, family, and the endless hum of memory. His laughter returned softer now, but brighter. Visitors often described a serenity around him, a kind of still joy. He seems to glow, one said, like someone who has already made peace with the infinite. When his final day came, it was gentle. He had spent the evening before listening to one of his old recordings, The Blue Danube. Of course, and, at the final swell, he whispered, "Perfect." His wife found him the next morning, seated by the window, a faint smile on his face, the violin resting beside him. The candle from the night before had burned down to its last inch of wax. News of his passing spread around the world in hours. Flags were lowered in Maastricht. Orchestras in 50 countries played the Waltz of Silence in tribute. No public funeral was held at his own request. Instead, the city organized what they called a night without noise. All concerts, radios, and televisions paused for 1 minute of stillness. In that minute, birds landed on the empty stage in Vredov Square, and when the clock struck midnight, one violin began to play from somewhere unseen. Some swore it was the wind through the wires. Others said it was André himself, reminding them that the song never ends. Years later, when tourists visit Maastricht, they still speak of the feeling that lingers in the air, a kind of invisible rhythm between the river and the bells. Guides call it the Golden Silence. Musicians call it Rieu's resonance. But those who loved him know better. It is not silence at all. It is the sound of gratitude for a man who taught the world to listen again. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the reach of hearing, in that endless cathedral of stars, André Rieu lifts his bow once more. The melody begins not in sound, but in light, and eternity itself sways gently in 3/4 time.